welcome to video 6-2. In this section, we're going to go over the weighted average method, its completion. In the last video, 6-1, we went over total equivalent units, how you calculate that number in both the weighted average method and the FIFO method. And now we're going to just narrow in on the weighted average method and finish the process costing cycle using the total equivalent units number we calculated in video 6-1 to create a cost or series of cost rates per equivalent unit, and then we're going to take those rates and apply costs to units completed and transferred out and to units in ending WIP. Like I talked about in video 6-1, you are creating three different rates, at most anyway. If your department doesn't have any transferred in costs because it's the first department in the chain, or there is only one department, then you don't have this third category. But at the very least, you're creating two different rates because you have almost certainly non-uniform consumption, and so you have a different total equivalent units for direct materials and conversion costs, and so you'll need to create two different rates for these two types of costs. And so yeah, we're going to go with the example of where you're a downstream department, so you're going to have three different rates that you're calculating. Make sure that you're keeping these types of costs separate as much as possible. Sometimes I see students make this mistake. Sometimes it's kind of odd because they'll go through and they'll do the direct materials total equivalent units calculation correctly. For example, say we're trying to get direct materials rate. They'll do the TEU with respect to direct materials correctly. But then they get confused about the numerator and say, well, I'm going to put some conversion costs in there or some transferred in costs. No, we're looking for a direct materials rate in this example. And so you would want to have the TEU with respect to direct materials in the denominator, and you want direct materials cost only in the numerator. So in a process costing system, I hope it is obvious that you're going to have some way of demarcating the different types of costs that you have. In our examples, we're going to have three types of costs: direct materials, conversion costs, and transferred in costs. And so you would have three different flags or codes that you would put onto a cost entry, an expense entry there. So you would have, oh, this is a direct materials cost, this is a conversion cost, this is a transferred in cost. And you would even code it that way when you're moving those costs to ending work in process and those costs that are getting transferred out. So even when you're taking the costs and moving them down here you're going to have some direct materials, some conversion costs, some transferred in costs, and you're going to have in the system some code that helps you separate those, because otherwise next period you couldn't separate them out in beginning WIP. And so we're going to calculate these three rates. We're going to keep the walls separating them very, very clearly. So in the numerator, the calculation is pretty simple. It's the beginning WIP costs for that type of cost, be it direct materials or conversion cost or transferred in costs, plus the current period costs for that type of cost, be it direct materials cost, conversion cost, or transferred in cost. And that's going to give you the rate. You have this numerator divided by the total equivalent units with respect to that type of cost that we talked about in the first video, 6-1, and that will give you the rate. And later in the next step, we'll talk about how you use that rate to be multiplied by the equivalent units in each of these two categories to get how many dollars are going between these two. But the idea is very simple. In weighted average, because we're just focusing on weighted average in this example, you take all the costs that are over here in the top part of the debit side that deal with your category of costs that you're calculating the rate for, all the direct materials costs, for example, if you're doing a direct materials rate, all of them that are over here that are either in beginning WIP or that are current period direct material cost that's incurred, and you're going to divide that by the total equivalent units represented by units completed and by equivalent units in ending WIP. Remember our weighted average equation right here. So you're taking the dollars right here and dividing them by the equivalent units that are represented over here, units completed and transferred out, and the equivalent units that represent the ending WIP down here, and that gives you the rate. That's weighted average for you. And so in our example, let's say we have a firm that completes 20,000 units this period. We have 500 left over at the end that are in the ending WIP. They are 40% complete with respect to conversion costs. At the end of the last period, we had 600 units that were still unfinished, and last period's ending WIP becomes this period's beginning WIP. they're 60% complete with respect to conversion costs. Our beginning balance in dollars now, $15,000 for beginning WIP, which is correlated with these 600 units that are 60% complete with respect to conversion costs. And we have current period conversion costs of $300,000. Now we're just going to do one rate in this example, so we're focusing in on conversion cost per equivalent unit. So I don't need to tell you what the rule is for direct materials. Are all direct materials added at the beginning of the process, 50% through the process, at the end of the we don't care. If we're just calculating conversion costs, we only need to know the percent complete with respect to conversion costs, because that will help us get the total equivalent units in the denominator. And then we need to know the costs associated with conversion costs in our beginning balance in the WIP account and those current period conversion costs that we incur, because those are the two parts of the weighted average rate, the denominator respectively and the numerator. Denominator, numerator. This is also the denominator, the units completed. We need that. Okay, so I calculate this rate out for you right here based on, we'll start with the TEU calculations. First one we went over in the last video here, right? We said there are 20,000 units completed, that we need that plus the equivalent units in ending WIP, which we have 500 units in ending WIP, and they're 40% complete. Therefore, they represent 200 equivalent units. So we have that 20,000 plus the 200. We have total equivalent units of 20,200. Excuse me, 20,200. And then that's the denominator. We're going to divide this total right here. Our beginning WIP costs that are conversion costs. Our beginning conversion costs in beginning WIP and our current period conversion costs. Add those together, and you get $315,000 of total conversion costs for this period. So you're going to take this in the numerator, that in the denominator, and you get $15.59, which is our conversion cost per equivalent unit. Now, the logic of this is real simple. Don't get lost in the fact that we have so many equations and so many steps. The logic is very simple. We're going to take the dollar amounts right here, and we're going to move them to the units represented by these two categories right here. So we need to create a rate that does that very thing. It has in the numerator the dollar amounts right here, and in the denominator the total equivalent units, which is the parts down here that we're going to assign those dollars to. And now that we have this rate, we can begin to allocate the cost. For conversion costs in this example, we just have a conversion cost rate, so we can complete the conversion costs that go into ending WIP and the conversion costs that go into completed units. If we're building off of the $15.59 example up here, we have a rate for that, so we can allocate those conversion costs to ending WIP and to completed units, which are going to be credited to this WIP account. That's what this means right here. That this is our amount that we credit to this WIP account and move over to either the next WIP account if there's another department that processes these goods even further beyond us, or they're credited to us and get moved over to finished goods, because we're the last department in the chain, and so once we complete them, they're done. Then we're going to sell them. So we need to know the amount here, the amount here, and we have conversion costs, so we can get the conversion cost amount here and the conversion cost amount here. All right, now I also give you, and this so we can have a complete example, I give you the rates for the two other types of costs. I just create an example in Excel, and we don't need to worry about going through that. It would work the same way. The direct materials cost would work the same way as the direct material rate would work the same way as this right here. Except we would have our total costs with respect to direct materials in beginning WIP and current period. Direct materials cost, they would be different numbers. And we'd have our total equivalent units with respect to direct materials. But we'd have the same division. We'd have in the numerator, we'd have direct materials cost, which includes beginning WIP and current period costs. And in the denominator, we would have total equivalent units with respect to direct materials, which includes units completed and the equivalent units in ending WIP. And we would get our $20.50, I say down here, of our direct materials per equivalent unit rate. Now, what we can do now with each of these rates, $15.59 for our conversion cost per equivalent unit, $20.50 for DM per equivalent unit, and $14.25 for TI per equivalent transferred in cost per equivalent unit. And it's the same over here, in this side over here. And we can multiply those by the equivalent units represented by each category. Ending WIP. How many ending WIP equivalent units do we have? Well, we just calculated that a second ago when we were creating our total equivalent units. We need to sum them to create the rate. But then when we're going to apply them, we're going to take this part of our calculation, this sub-step of our calculation, our ending WIP equivalent units. With respect to conversion costs, we need to multiply the conversion cost rate by that number to get the cost that goes to ending WIP. And then we take the other part of that denominator, of the total equivalent units denominator, 20,000 units completed, multiply our conversion cost per equivalent unit rate by that to get the dollar amount of conversion costs that go to units completed. That is, they get credited to our WIP account and debited to either a downstream WIP account or finished goods. Same thing with direct materials. We take the direct materials rate of 2050, multiply it by the ending WIP equivalent units. In this case, they must be 100% complete with respect to direct materials because there were 500 units in ending WIP. And if we end up with 500 equivalent units, that must mean that the percent complete is 100%. For direct materials here, multiply that 2050 by that 500, we get 10,250 equivalent unit, ending work in process cost. So that's our DM, our direct materials cost that goes into our ending WIP. And over here, we have our rate, 2050, $20.50, multiplied by our units completed, which stays the same throughout each of these because they're completed with respect to conversion costs and with respect to direct materials and with respect to transferred in costs. They're completed. So we multiply our rate by units completed, and we have $410,000 as our dollar amount of direct materials cost that is going to go to the credit side of a WIP account and therefore get debited over to a downstream WIP account or finished goods. Transferred in costs. I hope this isn't getting too repetitive, but going over it in each step, I hope either cements it in your mind or relieves you of any doubt that they're handled differently. They're not. We have different equivalent units that we use to calculate the rates, and that now we're using to apply those costs through the rate, like the 200 versus 500 here. We have different rates because we have different numerators and denominators sometimes, but the procedure you're going to follow is the same. Here, both in terms of between categories of cost, conversion cost, direct materials, and transferred in cost, you're multiplying rate by equivalent units in the category by cost, and that's true in each of these big categories. And it's true across the two different types of applications we're making. We're applying cost to ending WIP, and we're applying cost to units completed and transferred out. And so we're going to be doing the same procedures in each of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little sub-calculations. It's repetitive. But people get it wrong so much, it's worth me going through the tedium and showing you that they are in each instance the same calculation, the same procedure. Just got to keep your numbers straight. Labeling, in this case, can make or break you. If you label it correctly and keep the labeling consistent throughout, then you can succeed in these problems within short order if you're having trouble with them. So we have our rate for total equivalent. We have our rate for transferred in costs per equivalent unit. Here we go. 1425. We're going to multiply it by our ending WIP equivalent units with respect to transferred in costs, and we end up with 7,125 total ending WIP cost for transferred in costs. That's how much of the transferred in costs we incurred this period and had at the beginning of the period in beginning WIP go to ending WIP. Then we have our rate, 1425. That's our transferred in cost per equivalent unit multiplied by the units completed, 20,000. We end up 285,000. We end up with $285,000 of units completed cost with respect to transferred in costs. So what you do then is you sum up each of these three totals, and you end up with a total ending WIP cost, $20,493.81. That's this number plus this number plus this number. Our conversion cost plus direct materials plus transferred in cost equals our total ending WIP cost. Now, again, in the system, these three will be marked separately. They will have, at the very least, they will have some sort of field in which they have a marker, an identifier that allows them to be classified as conversion costs or direct materials cost or transferred in cost, because when you do this calculation next period, you're going to need to be able to separate out your conversion costs in beginning WIP, your transferred in costs in beginning WIP. I don't have an example. Your transferred in costs in beginning WIP and your direct materials costs in beginning WIP. But if you're just interested in the total number, here it is right here. Likewise, we have a sum here, and this. We have a sum of this cell, and this cell, and we get our $1,006,881.19 cost for units completed. The total cost. That includes conversion cost, direct materials, and transferred in cost. That's the total credit to our department's WIP account. It's either debited to the next department in the chain or to finished goods. Sometimes firms will keep a tab of these numbers as well for completeness. Keep a tab of them as in demarcate whether it's a conversion cost, a direct materials cost, or a transferred in cost. Although you don't technically need to do that for the system to work, because if these are being debited to the next department's WIP account, they are all transferred in costs for that department. They're all this $1 million plus are all transferred in costs for that next department. They don't care whether they were conversion costs or direct materials costs or transferred in costs to you. They're upstream. It's upstream of our department. That's all we care about. So you might have some interest in keeping these numbers separate so that you can track them, so you can try to manage and control costs and understand and hold people accountable for whether they're doing a good job with the units completed in these different categories, if you have separate managers that deal with those things. But you don't need it to make the system work. You have to keep these three costs separate somehow. You have to keep in the system some marker to show, oh, this is our ending WIP cost that is from conversion costs, because you're going to have to parse that number out next period in beginning WIP when you create your conversion cost rate for that next period. And then the same thing for direct materials cost when you create your direct materials rate for the next period, and your transferred in cost when you create the transferred in cost for next period, transferred in rate for next period. And wow, we did the whole thing. Look at that. We went through creating the rates and the cost allocation. So what I often tell people is that there is a little bit of a trade-off between weighted average and FIFO. Even though I say this, every student says that they prefer weighted average. They don't like the extra step that you have to do later. We'll talk about that in the next video in FIFO when you apply the costs. It takes a little bit of pre-planning and a little bit more organization when you already have about 5,000 steps. I'm exaggerating, but 5,000 steps in process costing. Each one in isolation being easy, but in their totality, they can just be feel like a whole planet crushing you while you're doing them. When you have 5,000 steps like that, having that extra step in FIFO still becomes the tiebreaker for many people. They like weighted average better, but still, I'll repeat what I say to the students a lot in person, and is that if you look at the equations here, weighted average technically has a more complicated numerator equation. This is total costs for each category equals beginning plus current. So there are two terms here. It has a slightly less complicated denominator. Has two terms here, whereas FIFO has three terms. Yeah, the thing I haven't said yet, which we'll get to in the next video, is that under FIFO, when you calculate the rate, you're only going to include current period costs in that numerator. Oh, spoiler alert. But the idea is, yeah, you need to make sure that you have that trade-off. If all the calculations require fewer steps than weighted average, you're doing something wrong. You will have at least one more addition step in the numerator here in weighted average than in FIFO. You'll have one fewer step in the TEU, in the total equivalent units. Down here. And I think that's it. That's as long as I can drag this video out for. This to get good at it requires some repetition of the steps, some review. I hope by grounding it in theory, by helping you see where these numbers are all coming from and why the complications exist the way they do, it helps you remember and leave yourselves a kind of set of breadcrumbs so you can come back to things you've forgotten, so that you can work your way back. Oh, I don't forget that step, but I know, for example, this is in your head. I forget this particular step, but I know for sure that weighted average is simpler in its total equivalent units than FIFO. So I think it's just these two terms. Maybe that'll help you. So I hope that you, with practice and with some of the mnemonics that I've given you and the setup that I've tried to fit everything together in a logical way, help you remember these steps with weighted average. And that's it for me. Bye.